I'm curious. I want to pick your brain about something related to Ohio State. You mentioned Ryan Day coaching in a shell, and then all of a sudden against Georgia, they turn into like New England Patriots level like team and almost won the game at the end. What do you like? And then obviously with Georgia like getting like just dropping TCU the next game and Michigan losing to TCU barely. I've been having trouble like computing that. Like what do you think was kind of the factor of how like maybe did Ohio State just have a better like post game like postseason training regimen, or like what do you think was a factor in just how like this all happened?
I think it's multiple things. I think one of the and I obviously didn't see the entire Ohio State Georgia game because I was still at the stadium in Glendale, but I did see the second half, most of it, and I think in part it's matchups, right? Georgia, I don't think its defense was quite. It probably on paper was as good as Michigan for the most part, but I also don't think that they had faced an offense as good as Ohio State's.
True.
Georgia didn't have the benefit of also game planning for Ohio State for the entire year the way Michigan did. And I think that plays a pretty big factor, right? Because it's Michigan is sitting there watching every Ohio State game, the staff, the players, all of that throughout the year. That's kind of a change from where things used to be. They are certainly focusing on that game. Georgia didn't have that benefit. So when they see Ohio State lined up a certain way, while they had a couple weeks to take a look at it, Ohio State also had a couple weeks to kind of self-evaluate and kind of break some tendency and things of that nature. So I think that those things kind of played into that. And then on top of it, for the difference between Michigan, TCU, I think Michigan took TCU lightly, to be honest, and from the players to the coaches. And it's, I mean, to myself, right? I was out on Locked On Wolverines podcast, speaking of it as a foregone conclusion. I had my flight home from, well, I didn't actually have my flight home from California, but I had no return flight from Phoenix. I had Disneyland tickets, right? Like I think we all just looked at it and said, there's no way that Michigan loses to TCU. And I think TCU was a little bit better than Michigan thought it was going to be. And I think that that Michigan certainly helped in every single possible way. Not just 2 pick sixes, but 2 goal line turnovers. I mean,
yeah, Michigan shot itself in the foot like 300 times in that game. And whether you look at the play calling, you look at the execution, you look at the defense maybe not being as strong as normal, it just seems like there's something where, and I noticed this in the Georgia game too last year, where it's almost treated as like an educational trip. Because if you watched some of the Instagram lives that the players were doing in that, like before the Georgia game, where they were on the yachts and stuff, and they were taking, if you remember that, like the boat tours and everything, they were enjoying it. And I'm like, are they fully locked in? Because it seems like they're not. And maybe they were a little bit more this time, but it still seems like there's some type of disconnect. And I'm wondering if that's why Chris Partridge is back, because as we know, when he was on the staff in 2015, did win a bowl game. So maybe they want to bring some of that magic back. Do you think that has something to do with it?
I think a little. I don't think it's necessarily at that bad this particular year. I mean, I think they wanted to beat TCU, but I think that they had convinced themselves more of like they weren't lining up against the number 3 team in the country. I think that they looked at it as we're lining up against Indiana. And I think that was the level of gamesmanship the coaches brought, that the players brought, like not recognizing the moment. It's, I think it doesn't help that, the Big Ten championship game in the last 2 years, that's essentially what they've had to do. So it's not overcoming in the same way as like Georgia against LSU, where it's this, we have to face, Goliath before we go and face, the local army. It's something kind of more where in line with like Michigan's big hump is getting over Ohio State. And then once it gets over that, then they get the consolation prize from the West.
Right.
And it's
The
one thing when
McDonald's Playhouse, as we call it, the Big Ten West.
exactly. And I just think that they needed to look at TCU as being another Ohio State. And I just don't think that they did. And
Yeah.
I think it was a collective effort at losing. And I think that they did a great job honestly at staying in the game, though if they would have been smart about it, I think if Donovan Edwards scores on that first play, or if they managed to get a touchdown on that first drive, and then do what they did on the ensuing drive for TCU, where they shut them out 3-and-out, I think the game goes completely different, because now TCU's got they are who we thought they were, type thing, or at least who we heard they were. But TCU also went into that game like I said this all week long. Every time I talk to anyone at TCU, from Garrett Riley to Quentin Johnston to literally any single person, it was like they knew something and it was weirdly, it was similar to talking to Michigan guys before the Georgia game. It just turned out that the Michigan guys didn't know anything. They thought that they did, until they stood up next to the Georgia players and realized that they're twice our size and twice as fast.
Right.
So,
It's actually, nothing, Jon Snow is definitely what that was like.
oh, absolutely.